Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing something a little bit different from what we usually cover in our witchcraft class. Today we'll be talking about a contemporary witch that did not have the sort of tragedy that we see with a lot of the other witches that we studied. So let's go ahead and get into it. Gerald Gardner was born near Liverpool, England in 1884. He was born into a moderately wealthy family that allowed him to have some accesses and experiences that most other people would not at the time. He was mostly raised by his nursemaid and not directly by his family. He had asthma, and the winters in Liverpool made it pretty difficult for him to get by without getting exceptionally sick. So his nursemaid, who was from Ireland, offered to take him to warmer climates for the winter months in order to kind of help him live a healthier lifestyle. And that's what happened. They were able to travel across Europe in his early childhood, and he grew quite fascinated with archaeology, anthropology, and studying different religions and cultures throughout Europe. But eventually, his nursemaid ended up getting married, and she moved out to the east. When she did so, Gardner followed her. At that point, he was used to the freedoms that she allotted him and was ready to kind of move on with that. And at just 16, he went to what is now known as Sri Lanka in order to work. He worked on a tea plantation for about 19-ish years. And in so doing, was able to make himself a little bit of money and then went on to work in other places in the east. So he moved around to Borneo, worked on a rubber tree farm, and then went to Malaysia to be a rubber tree inspector and then eventually an investigator of opium. While doing so, he became quite interested in Eastern customs, cultures, religion, and history, especially weapons. He actually had a fascination with ancient Malay weapons and wrote his first book, actually, on that. But this kind of just goes to show that he found a lot of interest in ancient societies and adapting to different cultures and religions as he found them. Which eventually, when he retired and went back to England, and this was in around the 1920s, he found himself getting even more interested in the occult. So when he retired, he led some expeditions in Europe for archaeological digs and became quite interested in goddesses and old pagan traditions. And then eventually, when he came back to London with his wife, he found himself being recruited into the New Forest Coven, which was led by, allegedly so, Dorothy Clutterbuck. She was quite an interesting figure and quite influential on Gardner. He found her to be quite interesting, as well as what she had to offer as far as the occult goes really brought him closer to that sort of old ancient customs and traditions that are found in neo-paganism with what he was interested back in the East. So it allowed him to further that hobby of his of looking into these old religions and kind of become a part of that. Around this time as well, in the 1950s, England decriminalized witchcraft, which basically allowed Gardner to take what he learned from this coven, as well as all of the readings that he'd done on other pagan traditions and pagan festivals, and compose them and publish them without putting it under the guise of either a religious piece or a novella, which he had done previously while with the New Forest Coven. And arguably his most famous and influential work that he did, published in 1954, was Witchcraft Today, which not only kind of outlined how witchcraft was being conducted in modern covens and in modern witch circles, but also was a call to arms of sort to revitalize witchcraft and bring a new interest into the subject, as he saw it to be a dying matter that he wanted to preserve. And in order to do so, he actually made his own coven. And this is kind of where we get into how we think of Gerald Gardner as one of the founding fathers of Wicca. Wicca is kind of just a general term, but more specifically to Gardner, we have Gardnerian Wicca, which really is kind of tumultuous in its start because Gardner claimed that he himself kind of stumbled onto this ancient, undiscovered religion that held occult and magical powers. This, soon after his death, was found to be not the case, quite clearly so. Basically, Gardner's form of Wicca was more or less founded on the influences that he had derived over the course of his life. There were influences from Eastern religion, his experiences with the New Forest Coven, as well as the readings that he'd done on pagan traditions. And this was kind of seen in his Sabbaths. He famously had his Wicca calendar, which had 8 large festivals, which were really just taken from other pagan traditions, though he claimed that this formation of them were really his own, which is more or less, in a sense, true, but not to the extent that he portrayed it. But as he developed his coven, he did recruit witches. Famously, he had one American that, once learning Wicca, went back to the United States and was responsible for its widespread growth and popularity there. One of the most famous works that came from Gardner during this time was his Book of Shadows, which he composed with one of his witches that went through rituals and sort of the secrets to be withheld in Gardnerian Wicca. So it makes Gerald Gardner, at the end of the day, so interesting, especially in the context of our classes. Now we're starting to get into a more accepted time concerning witchcraft, especially in the Western world. It's no longer used explicitly to dehumanize certain peoples or criminalize them. Instead, it's almost just something that people can get into if they so please, and no longer has these stigmas around it that these people are doing evil. Of course, these beliefs are still held by some, but in the broad general view, witchcraft is seen more as a sort of neo-paganism instead of some sort of devilish act committed by those practicing it, which is a pretty big change from what we've seen previously, which is why Gerald Gardner is kind of heralded as this founder of Wicca. And obviously we can see people practicing Wicca today, especially in social media spheres such as TikTok, which is quite interesting. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to discussing this in class with you all.